yeah, the idea is these guys were human. Something's happened to them, I don't know what. Hello and welcome to Painting Kings of War, Shadows in the North 2-player starter set, Part 2, Spectres. We're going to start with some cleanup of these models. The mould lines do need to be removed if you want a nice finish. These hard plastics are a little bit like Games Workshop hard plastics, just need a bit of scraping to get rid of the mould lines. They're pretty good sculpts, these. Second part of the preparation for me is pinning the models. I want to paint these guys pretty quickly, it's kind of like a batch paint. Just going to drill some holes into their feet. Put the wires inside with a little bit of super glue. Just be careful with the drilling. You can see how I'm holding it there, you can easily slip the drill off and pop it in your thumb. You don't want to do that. Recommend wearing goggles as well if you're clipping metal. Pop it in the foot with a little bit of super glue on the end, let that dry for 10 minutes. Quickly drill some holes in the little bit of soft wood here. Guess what's coming next, I'm sure. Just gonna use the pliers to put these guys, mount them on the wood, ready to go. You can see I've already spray painted something else there that I've stuck on the wood before. Okay, so I've already undercoated these guys with the airbrush, sprayed them black, and then from above sprayed them with a grey primer. So black primer from below, grey primer from above, lots of light grey primer, but they're not white enough for the technique that we're going to use to paint these guys to work properly. We need them to be quite white on the top, and also using the dry brush technique here we'll pick out some of the hard lines like on the clothing. These sculpts are actually quite smooth with the skin, but with the hard lines we want those to stand out, so we're dry brushing from above downwards to make sure the white paint ends up mainly on the top of the model. First mistake here, trying to airbrush the contrast paints. So I've basically got a mix of Magos Purple contrast paint, bit of contrast medium, spraying onto this guy. They spray lovely through the airbrush, but it's not the effect that I'm looking for. You can see that it's kind of filtering the underlying zenithal highlight that we've done, zenithal base coat, in a uniform manner. I don't want that. I want the contrast paint to kind of work like contrast paint, where it settles into the recesses to add additional depth. So I've got exactly the same mix here, and I'm just popping it on with a brush just to kind of see what it looks like. You'll see through this video that I'm kind of walking through a couple of mistakes that I made. I say mistakes, just trying different things that didn't quite work out. Quite pleased with how this contrast paint is looking on top of the zenithal base coat, so I won't be airbrushing any more of this model. It's going to be all put on with the brush. Got Magos Purple, Guilliman Flash and some blue ink. Not going to have a whole video just showing you me mixing paints, but where it's important I'll just show you sort of how much roughly I'm putting in of the different elements into the mixture. Guilliman Flash is quite yellow. I quite like that for these guys. They're sort of, I guess, humans turned into zombie type things and then possessed, so a bit of yellow skin's not a problem. This blue ink is quite strong, the Vallejo Game Colour blue ink, so I only put a drop in there. Putting quite a lot of the contrast medium in here. You can see I'm using the other end of the brush, that's just so that I don't accidentally put any ink into the contrast medium that might be left on the brush, because then that medium is kind of ruined really. You can see it's a mixture of contrast paints, ink, and then about the same amount of medium as well, just to thin it down. Starting off with Guilliman Flash out of the pot to give a more human initial skin tone on the areas that are still somewhat human on these guys. Now going in with that plummy mix that I made earlier, just pulling it over all the other spectre-y type areas where the tentacles are coming out of this guy. You're going to see sort of how I went about batch painting these 20 guys. So I started out doing it like this, where I put the human flesh down and then go in with this sort of general plummy colour on all the tentacles. A little bit later in the video you'll see that I decided to do it the other way around. Just speed this up and just sort of get an idea of where I'm putting the plum colour mix. Not being super careful with it at this point, and I'm mixing it into the gillum and flesh, which is still wet, on the areas where the two colours meet. Just finishing off putting the plum colour on his head. I'll experiment later with different colours on the hair. Not really sure if it's hair, but I'm going to call it hair. Contrast paint Black Templar and the blue ink here. So this is to make a dark blue colour for the clothing. Kind of wanted to look a little bit like, kind of like denim, I suppose. I wanted the blue because the butchers in the army are going to have a sort of a dark bluey black skin. I wanted it to sync up a little bit. I wanted that colour to be a consistent colour across the army. You can see me mixing in quite a lot of the contrast medium here. Not so much of the blue ink because it is quite strong. Sort of see how thin this is. It is like a glaze, it's quite thin. It's actually quite black at this point, it's not as blue as I'd like it, so I'm going to show you how this goes on, and then shortly I'll be going back in and adding in some extra blue ink. Wanted it to stand out more. Really I wanted a greater contrast between the skin colours, which are going to be sort of reds and yellows, and then more of a blue colour on the remnants of the clothing. There you go, you can see putting another big drop of the blue ink in there. Now you'll be able to see here when I test it that it's definitely now a lot more blue. Batch painting these guys, I mainly went for this blue colour, and then some of them added in a little bit of green ink. Kind of wish I just stuck with the blue across all of them, but wanted a little bit of variety. Just don't think the green quite works so well with the skin colours, but it is what it is. They look okay for a bunch of dead people that have turned into, I don't know, sort of nightmare zombies. Okay, so the plum colour that I had in the tentacles, I actually want that to be more red. I've decided it was not quite what I wanted, so going in with some red ink and the Magos purple, which I really recommend. I really like the Magos purple paint. It is more of a pink than a purple though. So just going over all the tentacles now. So this model is dry underneath, so we're kind of reglazing over to sort of bring out the more red colour of this mix that I've made. Because it's using contrast paint medium, you could put it on quite thick and it will work again like contrast paint, but I'm trying to be a bit more careful and use it more like a glaze, kind of a reasonably heavy glaze. You can see I'm using like a really big brush here. It's just a cheap synthetic brush, size 6, so it's quite big, but it's absolutely fine for doing work like this where it's not super critical if some of these colours bleed into each other a little bit, because this is a guy that's in the process of turning from a human into a tentacled zombie man. You can see I'm batch painting these guys, so I will be moving between some of the different models during this video, but you know, you kind of get an idea of how I've tried to give some variety to the guys that are going to be in this unit. Went in with the purpley, like a purple colour mix on this guy. Now going in with the red, the more red mixture. Now going in with the more red mixture on the area of the tentacle that meet the skin. And that's what I'm going to do on most of these guys, have the tentacles turn a little bit from red into blue, just to make them interesting. Where you see me using a more blue or a purpley colour is basically the mix that we made earlier with the Magos purple, contrast medium, blue ink, red ink in some combination of those colours. Using the red mix to go around the gums, on the tongue, just to give it some interest there. Now this guy's dry, you can see that the colours do dull down a little bit when the model dries. But you know, for a tabletop standard, you could kind of just chuck that straight on the table now. It looks alright. You know, I quite like it. You can use a bit of contrast paint, wildwood, and agaros dunes here. Sort of dark brown and a yellowy colour, kind of yellowy brown ochre. Not really an ochre, kind of a yellow but not a bright yellow. Gonna use some of the agaros dunes on the hair. Again, I'm really not sure if this is meant to be hair, if it's a human hair that's now turning into an alien form, or whether or not these are meant to be painted more like the tentacles. I wanted to give them a kind of a hair type of colour on most of these models, again just to add some interest and make it stand out a little bit. If you've seen my video painting the butchers, you know that I really like agaros dunes. I think it's brilliant for things like this, like hair, like leather. Add a little bit of chestnut ink into it, or a bit of skin wash, and you've got a really great leather colour. Using the agaros dunes and then maybe grabbing a little bit of the wildwood, just mixing them in together if I'm wanting some extra definition in the shadows that the wildwood would produce. Now using a bit more of the purpley plum colour on the top of the head, just kind of blending it into the agaros dunes sort of while the contrast paint's wet on the model. It's a really good benefit of using the contrast paints like this, especially over a zenithal undercoat. You can really just sort of mix them in together on the model, especially for a model like this where they're quite organic. I'm going back in with the red now, just to strengthen up the redness of the tentacles. I think it looks pretty good now. Again, you know, you could do a load of those guys, base them up. Quite colourful. Teeth look a bit manky. They could do with tidying up a bit. I don't really like them. Okay, now let me know in the comments what you think about this. As soon as I put it on, I wasn't totally sold on the blue. It's just too out of place. It's too strong. You can see I did start to take it off a little bit and blend it in just to see what it looked like. Yeah, I'm not really sold on it, but I did leave this guy like this, and I'll show a bit later in the video how he turned out, and I'll show another model where I used slightly more complementary blue on the head. This does stand out a bit. Like I said, I'm not sure about it, but you know, let me know, see if you think it looks cool. These guys aren't real people, they can be whatever colour you want. So with this guy I'm going to go back in and reglaze over the top of some of the areas that I want to come out a little bit stronger. Just a good example really of where the tentacles can be, where the tentacle joins the flesh. You can sort of move some of the red paint onto the flesh, make it look like it's growing out a bit more naturally. Again, using the yellow on the hair for this guy. Put a bit more of a purpley mix on the head rather than the very bright blue. Kind of blends in a bit better and kind of works with the model as a whole, in my opinion. Using a bit of that red around the wounds in his stomach. It's really just a process of going back and forward with some of those glaze mixes and just slapping them on the areas that you want to strengthen up the colours. I'm just trying to be careful as I go through painting these models not to paint over areas that haven't been painted yet, because for example if you've got some of the blue off the clothing onto the skin or vice versa, that would definitely show through when you then went to repaint those areas, or when you then went to paint those areas. Mixing in some ivory here, some standard ivory paint, into the blue and the red mixes of contrast paints and inks that we already had. So we've got a slightly more saturated, very light blue, and a slightly more saturated light red. What I'm going to do first though is use just the ivory on the teeth. You can't use contrast paints to do this kind of layering, they're too runny. Using Vallejo Model Colour Ivory here, I move over to Vallejo Elfic Flesh Game Colour, a little bit more yellow, and yeah, I like it better, it goes on really nice. So here we're using that very light purple mix that we're getting from mixing the ivory with the contrast paint mix that we had from earlier. We're just going to kind of stipple that onto the raised areas, the areas that would catch the light from above. This isn't really totally necessary for a basic army standard model, but I think it adds an extra little bit of pop to those areas. I think it's kind of worth it if you can do it in just a few minutes. I set myself a goal of having these guys look, really good when all ranked up. So things I'm going to skip is, I'm not going to paint the toenails, for example. The toes are not that well formed on these models anyway, so those can just be forgot about because these guys are going to be 10 to a base when I multi-base them. It's kind of about setting standards at the outset, standards for the project as a whole, and trying to stick to them so that you do actually get finished, but to a standard that you're happy with. Going in with the red highlight mix here, same as what we did earlier with the blue one. Just sort of kind of using it a bit like a glaze and a little bit of stippling depending on how I feel. Always got a wet brush ready by the side of the palette to whip off any mistakes that I've made. Alright, okay, so at this point during the recording I actually had a new light which I have reviewed and you can check out. So you're going to notice that the colours seem to stand out a little bit more now on this remaining part of this video. It's just because the lighting was better. Going back to some normal glazing here, using that Gilliman Flesh, I decided I want these guys' skin, Gilliman Flesh and a bit of Agaros Dunes. I wanted their skin to be a bit more yellow. That's partly because I want them to be a little bit more consistent with the Scarecrow models that I'm also painting out, which are going to have a more yellow, dead zombie type skin. Back to this red ink, Magos Purple and contrast paint mix. Same as before really, just adding some additional glaze layers just to bring out that red colour a little bit more. By this point in the batch painting process I decided that I wanted this army to be quite colourful. I'd already painted the butchers and their bright blue skin, I thought looked really good, so wanted it to be a pretty colourful army. Just with those tentacles, I'm trying to make them go from the red colour into a purpley blue, back into a red. It just makes it look interesting. So here I'm going for a very thin down blue, and it's to really bring out the blue on the tentacles. So I'm mainly doing it underneath in the shadow areas. It does make the tentacles look more blue though in those areas that were purple. Again, it's part of that whole thing of I decided I wanted these guys to look, you know, pretty colourful. This is the guy with the blue head. Yeah, I'm not sold on that blue head, so only one or two are like that. So here's the elfic flesh that I was talking about. It's actually quite thick, so mix it in with some of the Agros dunes and you've got a perfect highlight colour. A perfect highlight colour for anything that was already yellowy, that is. So I start putting a few highlights here on the skin, and I'll be honest, I get to a point where I realise that it's not really worth it, not for the standard that I want to achieve, so I do a little bit, but then I don't give up, I just decide it's not worth it. I think it's worth highlighting the face and around the head, so the hair will get some highlights. You can see me here using the elfic flesh just to go back in and tidy up the teeth. By this point the teeth have had a bit of red put on them from the gums. The ivory's not that of a stronger colour. The Vallejo Model Colour ivory is not quite as strong as the elfic flesh, so I prefer using that on the teeth, that's why I went back over it. Just mixing in a bit more of the highlight colour now using the elfic flesh, which again, as I've gone through the process of painting these guys, I've realised is just better to be used for this purpose than the ivory. Just going to use this mix, which is kind of like I'm using it almost like somewhere between a layer and a glaze. Now on this guy I did experiment a little bit by highlighting the hair that goes from the blue on top of the head down to the kind of yellowy brown hair. I experimented with highlighting it with the blue mix, just to kind of see what it looked like really. Like I've mentioned earlier, you know, you can paint these guys how you want. They're straight out of your nightmares, they're not real life. They can be any colour you want basically. I'm not completely sold on highlighting the yellowy hair with the blue, but I wanted to see what it looked like, and it looks okay, but only a couple of these guys in the whole unit are going to be done like this. And it is using blues that I've used elsewhere, so you know, it does kind of tie in together, it just looks unusual. You can see me going around and just putting a few highlights wherever I feel like it. While I've got a bit of that blue mix on the palette, I'm actually just tidying up the bit of clothing there where some of the skin colour has got on top of it. It's just another example of going back in with some of the colours that we've already used just to strengthen everything. I'm kind of doing this as a bit of a comparison between Bluehead Spectre and a slightly more normal looking guy. And here I'm highlighting the more normal looking dude in a more traditional manner by highlighting the yellowish hair with a mix of yellow and the elfic flesh. I think it looks better, I think it's more consistent, it doesn't jar the eye quite as much as trying to highlight it with a cold colour like a light blue. You know, I'm pretty happy with how these guys are turning out. They're quite bright colours, and I don't normally paint like this, but I wanted this start collecting box set to, you know, really pop on the tabletop and be a project where I could put it all on the table. It really stands out. It's great fun to, you know, play with because it looks good. So yeah, old blue head on the left there. I'm not sure about that. So only a couple of those guys are painted like that. The camera's not particularly well focused here either, so I'll show some photographs at the end. But yeah, the idea is these guys were human. Something's happened to them. I don't know what. I'm not quite sure what the fluff is on these guys from Mantic. Something not very nice has happened to them. That's basically what's happening. They're growing tentacles out of their body. Their body's decaying. The skin's going to be turning yellow like zombies. I want them to look a little bit like the scarecrows that are going to come later. So yeah, let me know what you think. Or, you know, more generally, let me know if any of the techniques here would help you out with the project. Let me know in the comments. Give us a like if you have liked it. If not, give us a downvote, I guess. Rather you didn't, but it's up to you. Leave me a comment as to why you didn't like it. That'd be better. That'd be a nicer thing to do. This is a starter channel. Don't want loads of downvotes.